So I want to start off with one of the problems that I think are, it's organization, it's all across industries, different sizes, and it's been like this from the beginning. This chart skips right to how organizations respond to an incident. What can we tell about their ability to know, I've just had a breach, and I need to do something about it? So the first row up here is just asking the question, how quickly is an organization compromised? From the time that the bad guy starts knocking at the door till the time that some system is compromised, how long is that? Well, if you kind of do the across and down, that 60%, the big stack there, is over the hours field. So the lesson from that is some of these attacks happen pretty quickly. I mean, within hours, most attacks are done. They're already compromised your networks or systems. That might be a little bit depressing, but it's good to know it, right? If things really do happen that quick, I want to know that information. The next row is talking about how fast is it from the time they compromise my systems to when they steal data, or when they successfully find the data that they're looking for and remove it from the organization. And you can see that one's a little bit more spread out. And that has a lot to do with the nature of the attack. Some attacks are very quick. In other words, if I hit your website and I just craft a SQL statement that's, give me everything in your database in geek language, tech language, and hit enter. If you're not doing input validation and protecting your website from that kind of attack, it'll just spit up data immediately. So that would be an example of the seconds category. Whereas some of the ones that lean toward the months side are an attacker that gains access to a system, and they start probing different systems across the internal network, and then they gain access to another one and another one and another one, and finally they find some file server later on that has the information that they're looking for, and they steal that. So the point is, you can see that attackers are in the network for quite some time before they're detected in many cases, and this for us as defenders is a problem, right? Why aren't we recognizing that illegitimate activity is taking place in our networks over the course of hours, weeks, and months? We've got to improve our ability to do that. Third row is one of my favorites, discovery. 62% of all incidents are discovered only after months, right? It takes the victim months to know that they've had an incident. And again, this is, I don't have the chart, but if you look in the report, you're going to see a little jagged line where that shifts every year, but it's always ranged between 60-something% and 90-something%. So it's not getting any better, and it doesn't trend up or down, it just kind of fluctuates. Not only does it take a really long time to detect incidents, but if you look at this overall chart just on the left, ignore the small and large, but just look at the one on the left. This is asking the question, well, all right, how did the victim come to know that they had a breach? What method was used for them to come to that knowledge? Well, I don't have time to go into what each of these are. Again, you can check the report. But just notice that the first 5 have EXT. It stands for external. It wasn't an internal discovery. So if you look at that, the top 5 methods of finding out that I've been breached is I'm notified by some kind of external party. Some law enforcement agency that calls me up and says they've made an arrest, and bad guy hard drives had evidence of my business on there. Maybe a customer called and said my bank account doesn't look like it did yesterday. I'm seeing some fraud, something like that. So it's an issue. We're taking a long time to detect things, and we're usually not the ones that are detecting things. And I'm speaking we as all defenders. So we've got to figure out why. What's going on here. So I kind of want to dig into that as we go through. We're going to start looking at some of the attackers and the actions that are used and all of those kinds of things. But these are just problems that represent the landscape that we're dealing with, right? And it's good to understand what we're facing. So let's talk about some of the attacks that caused this issue that I just talked about. I don't have time again, and I don't think you want to know everything that this chart means. But just know that just as I showed you that terrible black mass that represented your threat landscape at the beginning of this talk, this is the same thing. This is a grid that represents every threat, your information that there is. And it's just a combination, every intersection is a combination of a threat actor and a certain kind of threat action, social engineering or environmental events or hacking or malware. And over here you have servers versus networks, and then you have what happened to that server or network. Was it a loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability? So again, there's 315 scenarios representing at a high level any threat to any kind of information asset through any means. And one of the things that I think is pretty astonishing about this is the findings, the very high level findings of what kinds of incidents were observed across that data set for those 19 organizations that contributed data to this report. And right away, even if you don't look at what's going on, you notice that there's a lot of white space there, right? What that is saying is, yes, there are a lot of theoretical threats out there that could harm me, but when I really study the problems that real organizations are having, there's 10% of the board, so to speak, that's really happening. And this starts to get into what I mean about patterns. The more information we collect and the more we look across a large number of organizations, it gives a kind of an automatic prioritization, if you will, of the threats that exist. Yes, you may experience something differently from this, but again, just overall, we're seeing some hot spots, if you will, where there's 10 or 15 different intersections where things are happening over and over and over and over again. And we got to ask the question, well, if you have limited security budget, which everybody does, and where do you place your bets, so to speak? Do you place it sort of down in the top or the lower right corner where there's not much going on? Or maybe in the upper left corner where there seems to be a lot going on? And I would suggest that maybe we should shift this way a little bit. So, and any organization can do this. This is just a matter of counting, did this happen? Yep, let me put a check in that box, and adding up all the check marks at the end of the year and seeing where they fall out. So patterns like this, and going back to this notion that threat actors are constantly changing and they're uber sophisticated and they're kind of almost not rational, they use random methods of attack. I think this evidence just flies in the face of that assertion. I think the threat actors that are out there are a lot more rational than we give them credit for. They're perfectly content to use the same methods over and over and over again until we force them to change, because they're like any other business that exists. I mean, we don't create a business process and then say, let's change it. We want to ride the business process as long as we can gain efficiencies for that. I mean, that's the nature of the beast, right? And the bad guys are the same way. They're going to create a tool, they're going to create a new attack, and they'll just use that over and over and over and over and over again as long as it's successful, because that's the most efficient way to do it. They're always looking for the cheapest way to steal data from you, and they will almost always use the cheapest way. So let me skip to this. This is just a little bit of information about the threat actors we see. And again, the top slide are different types of external threat actors. So the ones trying to steal your data that are outside the organization. And when we kind of break those down, you see 50, and I'm sorry for the triple bar charts. I know sometimes that's a little bit difficult to follow. I would just direct your attention to the one that says overall. That is across the entire data set, whereas small and large are sometimes showing that, hey, there's sometimes differences between smaller organizations and larger organizations. We're just trying to do a contrast. So pay attention to whatever you like. I'll usually be talking about just the overall statistics. So organized criminal groups are involved in 55% of the incidents that we see for external threat actors. State affiliated is actually a surprisingly high, in my opinion, 21%. And a state affiliated group could, it's not necessarily the army of some country. It could be a group that is, paid by a nation state or always working on behalf of a nation state. There's kind of some variation there. That's what we mean by a state-affiliated group. Unknown, unaffiliated activist groups, even though activist groups make a lot of noise, they're relatively low as far as the grand total of things that we've seen at 2%. I think the takeaway observation on the top chart here is the group theme, right? If you add up organized crime groups and state-affiliated groups and activist groups, that's the majority of the threat actors that we're seeing. We're no longer in a world where just single threat actors working alone in their mom's basement are the cause of all the threats that we're seeing, right? You as defenders are going up against organizations with resources that have specialties. Yep, I was hoping to...
see, the red light came on.
Is that a battery? I can switch to that.
Yes.
That's on my phone. All right, how is this? Good? All right. Okay, I'll try not to knock that off or something. So what I was saying is when you're thinking about defending against external threat actors, it's really important to remember who you're up against. You're up against groups who have resources, they have specialties. In a lot of these groups, you have someone that is very good at hacking into your networks. And then they have another person that's very good at writing malicious software and tools that do bad things after that. And then they have groups that are designed, other specialties that are designed to, once they steal information, they know how to quickly turn that information into cash if they're an organized criminal group. Or, it's the same thing that you see in the non-cybercrime area where money laundering and all of those things is important. Down on the internal actors, notice that cashiers are number one. Some people look at that and think, what in the world? That is really weird to me that cashiers are the leading perpetrator of insider data theft. Well, these are short labels. The longer one is cashiers, bank tellers, and somebody else. But just view them as money handlers. People that are near the books and they handle cash. A lot of times what we're talking about here is just petty identity theft. You go out and fill out a loan at the bank and you hand that to someone. Well, maybe they take a picture of it with their phone or they write down your details and then they go sell that to some fraudsters. And it could be the same in a retail environment or anywhere. Restaurants, wherever you go. End users are an issue as well. I like to comment that end users and system administrators are neck and neck in this overall chart at 17% and 16% of all incidents. I've been in the security professional arena, and I've been a system admin, and system admins like to talk about, the insiders are the problem of everything. If we could just get rid of the end users, we'd all have safe networks. Not so much, I don't think either camp there has too much to say. And in fact, if you look at larger organizations, the system admins are more often the cause of the problems. Over here on this chart far to the right at 31%, they beat out end users as the perpetrator more often. So, and you see executives and call center, it's a mixed problem. Basically, anyone who has access can and will steal that information given the opportunity and motive. So I want to shift gears here from the threat actors and concentrate on some of the threats. Now, this is, I know, an extremely busy slide, but again, I've been showing you this notion of threat landscape. In that Varus framework that I talked about, there are 150 something what we call threat actions, and these are them. starts with different types of malicious software at the top. And if you look at the bottom, tsunamis and volcanoes and things like that. So environmental events. So honestly, any natural occurrence, malicious occurrence, accidental occurrence that could harm your information assets should have a word or phrase somewhere on this chart. And if you think about it as a defender, you've got to have all of these things in your mind, and you've got to be doing something. Hey, are we controlling against these things? And could one of these, which one of these should we concentrate on? There's 150 something of them. That's a lot to deal with. I agree. So remember, we're talking about patterns, right? So we can't concentrate on 150 different things. So this tabulates data across 2,000 plus confirmed data breaches that we've studied over the past several years, again, from 19 different organizations around the world. And these are the top 20. So just like Tony was up here talking about, there's lots of different security controls that you could possibly implement on your networks. What he's trying to do is say, well, what are the top 20 controls that get us 80% of the way there and that we can all agree on? This is kind of the same thing from the threat side of the equation, right? This is the top 20 threat actions that successfully used by bad guys to steal information. And we can't go through all of these things, and we can't talk about every single word, but I think observation number one is the nature of the list. So there's 150 possible things that we say could go wrong. But by the time I get down to number 20, that's 4% of all incidents used number 20, which is unapproved hardware, which are someone using some unapproved USB token or phone or whatever it is in the course of stealing information. 4%, that's a pretty sharp drop off. That means the rest of those 150 are somewhere south of 4% in frequency, right? What that means for me is that if I'm trying to concentrate and figure out which of these 150 I need to focus on and spend my money on, hey, if I hit the top 20, I'm well over 80% of the way there, right? I mean, this really shrinks the problem domain down a lot. This is the advantage of patterns that available to us if we collect information and study it. Second observation I think is quite interesting is if you look at that top 20 list, it's not 20 totally unrelated things. You can kind of start to group them. So for instance, look at the first three. I'm sorry for those in the back of the room that can't see it, but the first three are brute force attacks, brute force or dictionary attacks, which means try a password over and over and over and over and over again until you land on the right combination. Number two is spyware, which is malicious software designed to capture your keystrokes as you type in your password, or capture your screenshot as you type in your password, or something like that. It collects user activity data. Number three is use of stolen credentials. So that might be you steal my password, for instance, and then you just use my username and password to log into my system, and the system thinks you're me, so it lets you in, right? So if number 1, 2, and 3, what's the common denominator there? Something about passwords or authentication, right? I think that's really surprising, because I don't know, if we ask everybody in this room what are the top 3 most common incidents, we'd probably get lots of different answers, and I doubt we would all agree that 1, 2, and 3 would all have something to do with authentication. If we're talking about priorities now, that really means that we ought to be thinking, well, how are we, what are we doing? What controls are we using to authenticate users? How can we tell legitimate from illegitimate? If passwords are weak, are we doing something else? Or are we thinking about two-factor authentication or other things like this? These are the conversations that I think we need to force ourselves to have. Because again, remember, I'm saying I want to knock this, attackers are always changing their methods, those kinds of things. I would say that attackers are kind of spinning around and focusing on common weaknesses that affect us all so that they can gain economies of scale across a large number of victims. And authentication is one of those. I mean, if you think about what we've done over the past 10 or 15 years in our networks and systems, have we brought anything back? I mean, we've only spread out the perimeter, right? You could say we've erased the notion of a perimeter around the network. We have more users accessing information from more devices and more places more readily than we ever have before. I mean, all of those trends are exacerbating the authentication problem. You know, and that's why the attackers are doing it. So it's a rational, conscious decision of, hey, most organizations are going to have this weakness because they're trying to authenticate users across a huge number of devices and do it really quickly and give them access to more and more and more things. So, you know, and again, a lot of this has to do with just understanding our adversary and why they do what we do. I think that's healthy for us as defenders because it gives us a place to start. There's lots of other places that you could pick in this list of top 20, and we could talk about them. But I think those are at a high level, a couple things. And then the third major observation, so number one was just the shape of the curve. Number two was you see patterns like authentication sort of rising to the top of being a real issue. And number three is that not everybody has the same set of issues. So I will direct your attention over to the small and large charts now. And you see, even if in the back, you can probably see the bars are just different looking. And it's representing the fact that, you know, take number one there. For smaller organizations, brute force attacks seem to be a huge problem. But for larger organizations, that's less than 10% of the problem. And you could ask why. And I'm pretty sure it's because smaller organizations have smaller IT staffs and lesser ability to automatically scan for things like weak passwords. And larger organizations are more likely to require a certain complexity and change password every now and then, et cetera. And you know, they're going to be more likely to root out and find systems and servers that don't meet those standards and get them fixed. So that has a lot to do with the difference there. All right, so that was top 20. We went from 150 plus down to 20, and I want to go to 5. And I find it interesting that that's the same thing that Tony did a little while ago. He went, there's 20 controls that are the consensus of everything, and then he said, yeah, but here are my top 5. So I'm going to give you the top 5 from the threat perspective. 2,000 plus breaches, global organizations. When I take these are individual threat actions. An incident is a series of threat actions, right? So it might start with brute force, but then it can go to something else and something else and something else. If I make scenarios by putting those together and saying, okay, a point of sale intrusion, for instance, often does involve brute force, and then they install spyware as a keylogger to grab credit card things when they're swiping the terminal, etc. But these are the threat scenarios, whatever you want to call them, but they're the top 5. So I think this is, I'm a data geek, I'm a security geek, so I think this is pretty shocking. I don't know about you. Point of sale intrusions are 43% of that entire data set. That just means, you know, a point of sale device where you pay for something. It could be in a shopping mall, it could be in a retailer, it could be in a restaurant or a hotel, doesn't matter. Skimming devices installed on point of sales or ATMs or other things like that, kiosks, ticketing things, it's just a device that when you swipe your credit card, it grabs it. You know, the fact that those two things are 66% or more of the entire problem of what all of those organizations are seeing is, again, really shocking to me, that you can simplify the problem space down that much. And maybe for many of you, that's not even part of your threat landscape, so you can just erase those and concentrate on the other problems. Web application attacks, insider misuse, and state-affiliated espionage are the other 3 in top priority buckets, if you will. And if you do the math there, you're nearly at 90% of all of those 2,000 plus data breaches from 19 different organizations around the world over the 3-year period that can be described by just 5 scenarios. And we all understand what these scenarios are. And so this is why I'm trying to knock this notion that the attackers are constantly changing, constantly changing, constantly changing. Yes, they're incredibly smart, but they're incredibly smart because they know stuff like that will work. You know, for retailers and restaurants and all of those organizations, point-of-sale intrusions are the easiest way to steal data, credit cards that can easily be converted into cash. web application attacks are really an issue because we all use web applications and they're hard to secure. It's not easy. And it's a very common threat vector. And if you wanted to, you could study this something else just to see how that 11% falls out. Point is, patterning is important. If we did more of this, I think we'd be a lot better set as defenders. So I know everyone, someone might be thinking, well, Wade, that's good. You can boil the ocean down to 5 different common threats, but you know, everybody's going to have a different list of 5 because everybody's different, and the threat space that they have is different. I'm not going to argue with that, but I will say that we could study that. We have the data, the information available to study that. So, and that's kind of what this chart does. I know it's gray. You guys in the back probably can't see. I apologize for that, but just imagine what I did. Every incident in the way we treat it is, I don't know if the metaphor of a DNA signature matters, but if I take, I had these certain threat actors and these certain actions used, and these types of systems were involved, and this is what happened, and I just kind of did a series of checkboxes for every single incident in this data set. And then I grouped incidents by industry, and I compared the difference of the typical incident for industry A and the typical incident for industry B, and there's some statistics that you can do here. This uses clustering analysis. I won't go any more than that. This is the chart that emerges, and it's just a measure of how similar are the attacks against one industry to the attacks in another industry. And you can see that there's some differences. So up here, you have transportation, manufacturing, and professional. This statistical algorithm sees, hey, those share a lot of the same attack space. The attacks that happen to each one of those look a lot alike. And down here at the bottom, accommodation, hotel, and things like that, food services, and healthcare, oddly enough, look alike. And you could say, well, what in the world? Why does healthcare look like a hotel? A lot of that has to do with the way you pay for things and the fraud that takes place and other things like that. But we can dig into that. We don't have enough time. Finance is kind of a bubble way off over there. And public, a lot of you guys represent public agencies. That would be where government falls in. It's kind of right there in the middle. And I think it's interesting that the interpretation of that is it shares some characteristics from a lot of these other ones. It seems to be off on its own. It's this dot there if you can't see it. But the reason it's off on its own and kind of in the middle is because, yeah, it shares some of these things that affect transportation and manufacturing, but it also, same thing as education and information, and a little bit from food services and healthcare. So, maybe your job is even harder because it's more multifaceted. It could be an interpretation of that. And just the last few things here. Not only can we study the attacks, and not only can we study different industries and show that, yes, they do seem to have different attacks that happen to them, we can kind of start to ask the question, why? This chart to the left just is overall, and the chart matches different threat actions like hacking and malware and social engineering and misuse to different types of assets, servers and networks and user devices. And I'm not going to go anything more and just notice the pattern. Up at the top on the right, the topmost chart is all incidents that we can determine are financially motivated. And if you just notice the pattern of threat actions to assets for the typical financially motivated breach is the top one. Below that is espionage. So when the motive is financial, it's saying attackers tend to use a certain combination of methods, attack methods or actions, and against a certain types of assets that we need to protect. On the espionage side, same thing, but notice the two patterns just don't even match up. I mean, they're not even remotely the same. And this is saying if you are a target of financially motivated attackers and the target of state-affiliated espionage-like attackers, those two groups of people are probably going to use very different attacks against you. Each of them have their own patterns, but they're very different. And you could study why, but just for now, notice the difference. Activism is the third one down. Notice activists almost use exclusively the combination of hacking and servers. That's because all they're trying to do is bust in and grab some information or just DOS your server or something that's loud and obnoxious, and they don't care about staying around. That's all they care about, is steal a bunch of information, throw it out on the web to embarrass you or knock your website offline. And they tend to use kind of a one-sided technique to do that. I could go on, but these kinds of things are just showing us that yes, there's a lot of differences here, and I think this is why we have this notion of attackers are incredibly complex and adaptive and things, but they're not so much so that we can't break it down and understand them and try to better prepare ourselves as defenders. I think this is worth talking about. Phishing. There's a statistic in this report that of all state-affiliated attacks, 97%, I think, of them use phishing as part of the attack chain. They did other stuff too, but phishing was one of the steps used. And you could ask, it doesn't make any sense to me why, with the resources of a state involved, why would they use something as simple as phishing? That I would think they'd use like space-age technology or something like that, right? But if you think about it from their perspective, this kind of gives some highlights on that. So there was a partner that does phishing campaign tests as a business, and they shared their data with us for this study, and basically. Over a large number of phishing emails, there's about a 24% chance that a user is going to click on a phishing email. These are not the terrible ones you receive, like that are worded awful and just are obvious fraud. These are something, decently crafted. 24% chance on average that a phishing email will be clicked on. If I send 10 of them, now there's over a 90% chance that at least one of those will be clicked on. I don't know of any other technical attack that has a 90% chance of success with 10 attempts. And it doesn't matter what organization you are in the room. It doesn't matter what systems you're using. It doesn't matter if you have Windows or Unix or anything like that. It is the one attack that works everywhere, because every organization has people that like to click on things. And that's why they use it. And I like this chart because even state-affiliated, which we would think would be the top echelon of sophisticated attackers, they're using a relatively simple technique because it's incredibly effective. And they know that, and they stick to this constantly, no matter who it is. It doesn't matter if it's the Defense Industrial Base or some lowly just consulting firm with a few people. This is the technique they use because it's going to get in the door. And then you could ask, well, Wade, it doesn't sound like what your message started out. That to me sounds like we should just roll over and play dead because they're going to get in. Don't worry about it. The point is that yes, we might have to see the fact that someone's going to click, but what happens if they do click, right? We could study that. Well, as far as we can tell in studying all these things, about one of two things happens when people click on a phishing email. It either installs malicious software on their device, or it tries to dial out and connect to some remote server on the internet. And if we think, well, if we can't stop the click, can we stop that? Well, sure. Tony had as his _1 control application whitelisting, which would be a control that's effective against installing on your desktop, because it would say, that's not whatever was attached to that phishing email is not an application on my approved list, not going to let that install. It would be effective. Scanning what goes outside of your network to malicious domains and all of those kinds of things. If we shared more threat information about which domains and IP addresses and things like that are illegitimate and malicious, we might recognize that. So it's not fatalist. I'm not saying give up. I'm saying we can, if we really try to break it down and understand what's really going on, there are parts that are going to be really, really, really hard for us to prevent and do something about, but there's probably another part of that attack that we can actually break the chain of events and do something about positively. And we just got to figure out where do we spend our money and efforts, what's most likely to be more successful. And in this case, I think the after the click is more successful than trying to get everyone not to click. Now, we should train users not to click. I'm not saying that. Just at some point, someone will. All right, so back to this question. I hope I've convinced you that the threat landscape that we're dealing with is a little bit more to the right. Maybe not exactly, but it's in that direction. And as we share more information, we do more research. We are a young industry. I think that's been mentioned several times this morning. Overall, we're gonna get better. So I'm gonna skip, sorry, all of this because I don't have time. And I'll just throw a few recommendations up there. As Tony mentioned, in the back of this report is an alignment of the top 20 controls that Tony was talking about to those top 20 threats that I just shared with you. If you wanted to know, well, what can I do about those 20 things? We also have these general recommendations up here. And notice, number 2 on the list is ensure essential controls are met. That would be, hey, the basic controls. Most of the time when we do an investigation, we find that incident traces back to something that we would all consider basic as security professionals. It's something that the organization thought they were doing, but maybe in fact weren't doing as well as they thought they were, or weren't doing as comprehensively as they thought they were. That's very often the problem. And again, these are in the report, so I'll leave you with that. Few addresses. I don't know. Do we have time for questions now, or?
Yeah, we do have time for questions.
Okay, I'm glad to take them. If you don't get a chance to ask a question, you can ask your question at that email address. We always try to be pretty prompt about replying to those things as well. So I guess if you want to ask something, raise your hand. I think there's a microphone traveling the room.
All right, then, we don't have questions at the moment.
All right.
Thank you very much.